America has shifted its policy and Russia has changed its atomic doctrine. The world is one step closer to a nuclear war and a third world war. Not taking Putin's warnings seriously could have serious consequences. War decides what remains. Looking at the entire battlefield, Donald Trump isn't in a position to stop the war over Russian issues. Einstein once said he didn't know what weapons would be used in the Third World War, but the fourth one would definitely be fought with sticks and stones. How's it going, friends? It's been over 1,000 days since the Ukraine-Russia war started, and there's been a big shift recently. For the first time, Ukraine is using American long-range missile systems against Russian targets. Meanwhile, the Russian president has threatened to escalate the conflict over the use of American and NATO missiles. But Ukraine and the US aren't paying any mind to that. On November 19th, Ukraine fired 6 tactical ballistic missiles at Bryansk in Russia's southern region, according to claims from Kiev. According to reports, they've targeted a Russian military warehouse full of weapons. This is a coordinated attack, and you'll soon see the war escalating and, unfortunately, spreading. Russian President Vladimir Putin isn't going to stay silent about this. He already sees the war nearing an end and is ramping up his attacks to gain an advantage on the battlefield. Just 2 days ago, on November 17th, he launched the biggest attack on Ukraine in 2 years, firing 200 missiles and drones all at once at Ukrainian energy sectors. The missiles were fired at their targets, launched from north to south. Russia's strategy in this war has been to hit Ukraine's energy, military, and economy sectors instead of just slaughtering the civilians. This approach can achieve the war's goals, and it's working. Ukraine is rapidly losing its resources. This benefits Russia because it puts Ukraine in a weaker position for any potential negotiations. In the attack on November 17th, Russia targeted Ukraine's major energy company, DTEK. Kabul has caused significant damage, and on top of that, Ukraine, which was already in the dark for days on end, is in an even tougher spot. It's a really cold region, and now that winter has hit, it's going to be rough for the next 6 months. It's pretty clear that the battlefield advantage is tipping in Russia's favor, not Ukraine's. To improve this situation a bit, US President Joe Biden. Then there was a big strategic shift, a policy change. The policy shift was that before November 17th, the United States, France, and Germany were all on the same page about giving Ukraine heavy weapons, but those weapons were only to be used for defense. They weren't going to provide weapons for deep strikes into Russia. The United States and Germany were especially emphasizing this. But now, President Biden, in the final days of his presidency, has allowed Ukraine to. The long-range missile systems, which are American, can also be used by Russia for attacks inside its territory, as you saw it did. France already transferred some of its long-range Scalp missile systems to Ukraine back in July. They sent a limited number, but they did it. France has been on board with the idea that Ukraine should be allowed to use long-range missile systems for offensive purposes, not just for defense. However, Germany and the United States disagreed, so that plan is still up in the air. He wasn't able to give permission. Germany was definitely not in favor of it. They weren't ready to give Ukraine their long-range Taurus missiles, which have a range of 500 kilometers, and they still aren't. According to the German Chancellor, they don't want to escalate the conflict by launching attacks into Russia with their missiles. In other words, they want to keep the possibility of a third world war to a minimum. That's why, on Friday, November 15th, for the first time in 2 years, he called Russian President Vladimir Putin. He talked to them, where he told the Russian president to come to the negotiating table with Ukraine to end the war. He also mentioned that Germany would continue to support Ukraine to keep up the pressure. Now, since Russia has the advantage on the battlefield, talking about any ceasefire right now would mostly mean accepting Russia's terms, which they will have to agree to. In this situation, Russia will come out looking like the clear winner. So, the German Chancellor's call didn't sit well with the Ukrainians at all. This has created the impression that Germany, a powerful military force in Europe, has started to withdraw its support for Ukraine and has initiated ceasefire talks with the enemy without consulting us. But the truth is that the German Chancellor has been against blind support for Ukraine from day one and wants to protect Europe from military conflict with Russia. This is because Russian President Vladimir Putin has previously threatened, and continues to do so, that if the United States or other NATO countries provide significant assistance to Ukraine for an attack on Russia, he would consider it an attack on Russia by NATO. Just remember, folks, that in situations like this, they've already threatened an atomic war before. The crazy part is, just like when they downplayed the threat of war when Ukraine was trying to join NATO, the United States didn't take it seriously back then. Now, even though they're allowing long-range missiles, they're still not taking Putin's threats seriously. That's why, right after the approval for the long-range missile defense system, there were messages from close circles of the Russian president saying that if there's an attack on Russia from American or French missiles, it could lead to a world war. This is just the same old threat from the Russian president, saying in different words that if Europe and America see us as attackers, we'll respond. Russia has over 4,000 nuclear warheads, and nobody wants a situation where it comes down to a power using nuclear weapons as a last resort. So taking this Russian threat seriously is nonsense. The Western powers, especially the governments of the United States and France, have already made this mistake, and the backlash is going to be severe. It's clear that Russia has changed a key part of its policy, specifically its nuclear doctrine. Until now, Russia's nuclear stance was that it would only use nuclear weapons if its nuclear assets were attacked by another nuclear power or if the Russian homeland was in serious danger. But now, President Putin has approved a new policy. If any non-state nuclear actor collaborates with a nuclear power to threaten the security of Russia, it could trigger a response. Nuclear weapons could be used against them, and the world has taken another step towards a terrifying war. Ukraine's weak government and country will be the first ones in danger. Now the question is, can the new American president, Donald Trump, change this battlefield equation and reverse the step that has already been taken towards war? Or is this situation now out of his control? We'll have to wait and see. Curious folks, the day Donald Trump won the American presidential election, and it was unofficially announced that day. Word about the situation reached the soldiers fighting in the Ukraine-Russia war, and soon enough, both Ukrainian soldiers and civilians started sharing all kinds of dark humor and jokes. They began saying things like, "Start packing your bags. The war's gonna be over in 24 hours." This joke was a nod to Donald Trump's comments earlier this year in July and November, where he kept insisting that if he became president again, he could end the Ukraine-Russia war in just one day. In response, a Russian official at the UN had something to say too. Trump was told, "You can't do that," but he was adamant that he could pull it off. In fact, just hours before officially being elected, he had a phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky and even brought in one of his biggest financial backers, Elon Musk. While they didn't go into details about their conversation, Zelensky's statements suggest that Trump talked about what Ukraine might want in order to end the war. The conversation is confirmed by his second call, which he made around the same time to Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan. If you look at both together, it seems like they were discussing the same old failed peace deal from April in Istanbul, where Turkey had almost managed to broker a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. So, Donald Trump might be trying to understand that context. Now that Trump is elected president and will take charge of the White House on January 20th next year, he's gearing up for his first foreign. The policy priority is about what to do to end the Ukraine-Russia war. So friends, one straightforward way to end the war or achieve a ceasefire is to force one side to admit defeat and surrender. Obviously, that would end the conflict, but this can only be done to the weaker party. In this conflict, the weaker party is Ukraine. Now, it's hard to believe that the United States can force Ukraine to surrender. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has made it clear multiple times that he will never give up. They're not going to be okay with leaving the territory under Russian control. They've made that clear. They're definitely not going to compromise on that. So, Donald Trump can't easily convince Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire along the current battle lines where both forces are positioned. This is why we set that aside. Now, let's look at the other side of the situation. Can the new American president, Donald Trump, pressure Russia to come to the negotiating table and agree to stop the attacks? Generally speaking, yes. Donald Trump could totally do this, and Putin has said multiple times that if he gets two guarantees, he's on board. First, Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Second, the land that Russia has already taken from Ukraine won't be returned. That territory won't come back to Ukraine. So, Putin is willing to negotiate on these two conditions. Now, the second condition is something we know President Zelensky will never accept. This means that the current Ukrainian president has to agree first. They're going to have to bring someone else in for the presidency, which means a re-election or some sort of drama. Honestly, the reports coming from the battlefield, even from Ukrainian media, suggest that if Russia offers the Ukrainians a decent way to save face, the Ukrainian army might be open to a ceasefire. Bit by bit, there's evidence surfacing, like from a Ukrainian war journalist named Natalia. She spent some time on the front lines with her soldiers and says that the Ukrainian troops are really worn out from the long fight. They're saying that the military is definitely not in a position to deal with Putin right now. Guys, you can totally overlook this second part of the news because a tired army can't demand to replace the enemy's leader when they're winning. That's just something said out of frustration. The real issue is that the Ukrainian state's resistance forces are exhausted and are realizing that after the American elections, a new world is on the horizon with new realities. They'll have to negotiate according to that, to gather what's left and maintain some dignity. There's more evidence to suggest that respect for the Sadat can be preserved, as seen in a BBC report where Ukrainian President Zelensky mentioned that he believes Donald Trump's departure today could lead to a quicker end to the war. Trump is likely to push for this, and the German Chancellor's phone call to the Russian president regarding a ceasefire shows that at least two Western powers want Russia to seriously consider giving Ukraine a face-saving option to take steps towards ending the conflict. At the same time, they also seem to have that impression. They're saying that if Russia doesn't comply, Russia should remember that we're standing with Ukraine. Let me tell you something, folks. President Putin has won this war despite facing 16,000 sanctions over 1,000 days of fighting. This has really weakened the alliance between Europe and America. President Putin will definitely exploit this weakness, but keep in mind, he won't overdo it. In other words, he might consider giving Ukraine a little face-saving gesture, like claiming that Ukraine can remain neutral, give security guarantees, and be ready to offer special rights to the Ukrainian population in Crimea and other regions that are now under Russian control. They could also recognize these areas as autonomous regions or semi-autonomous territories within Russia. Another concession could be agreeing to contribute to the reconstruction of the damage done in Ukraine. By making these kinds of face-saving moves, they could also negotiate the release of their 1,300 prisoners in exchange for Ukraine's 6,000 prisoners. Friends, there's a chance for some face-saving moves or something similar, that if Donald Trump can charm Ukraine, we might see a ceasefire along those lines today. If that happens, there are only two winners. First, President Putin, because he would have achieved all his military goals. He would have prevented Ukraine from joining NATO and annexed a significant part of Ukraine with a large Russian-speaking population. The second winner would be Donald Trump, as he would have pulled off a major foreign policy win. The deal got Ukraine out of the war somehow, but the real fallout from this will hit Europe after President Zelensky. Yes, after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, this is the first time Russian forces have entered and taken control of another country. Remember, back in the 80s, the Soviet Union fell apart because the US and its allies had their forces stuck in Afghanistan for a long time, which drained them over 10 years. But now with Ukraine, if the war ends in any way, it will prove modern Russia's strength over Europe once again. It will be clear that NATO powers, despite all their might and after causing around 400,000 Ukrainians to be killed or injured, couldn't reclaim even an inch of land from Russia. The tiny region of Kherson, which Ukrainian forces currently occupy, will have to be returned without any significant benefit in any deal, because the battlefield advantage is heavily in favor of Russia. If Ukraine doesn't withdraw from Kherson, the war will just continue. No more throwing hundreds of billions into this black hole for Europe and America. After that, the deal will go back to the same lines where the war is happening right now. It's a tough situation for Europe, America, and Canada and Britain, who are stuck in inflation and a housing crisis. But folks, there's another message that will go out to the world if this deal happens. That message is, no American alliance can just sit back and rely on that anymore. Yes, in 2021, America put its faith in Ashraf Ghani's Afghan government. He had fled, leaving everything to the mercy of the Taliban. And now just 3 years later, after spending a ton of money and giving Ukraine all sorts of hope, he's getting ready to bail out again, this time under Russia's influence, just like it happened with the Taliban. So, a ceasefire in Ukraine with Russia would be interpreted as a signal for places like Taiwan, the Philippines, Israel, and South Korea. As long as small groups keep attacking, the US will definitely stand by them, and they might have diplomatic support for a while. But if a major power launches a significant attack on American interests, who knows what could happen? How long will America keep standing by, and for how long will it support? Because America doesn't always stick to its promises. It makes decisions based on the mood of its voters before the next election. If the new president gets a vote for staying out of war, he'll find some way to back out while saving face. The whole world has seen how America reassured its puppet government under Ashraf Ghani with big claims, saying they'd stand by them. But when it came to the Taliban, they didn't even give a proper heads up about the negotiations happening with them. He understood and left Afghanistan for America, and now similar things are being said by Donald Trump's fanatical Vice President J.D. Vance. It looks like Ukraine is about to become another Afghanistan. He has repeatedly said that he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine. Whether the US loses support against Russia or wins, it doesn't matter to him. After that, on November 11th, Donald Trump appointed Congressman Mike Waltz as his chief security advisor, who has been focused on Ukraine all year. There have been ongoing questions about military funding, with some saying it's a burden on the American economy. The entire Trump team seems to feel that the war in Ukraine is a burden too. So, it makes sense that they'd want to wrap this conflict up quickly without doing much homework, so they can focus on their domestic issues like immigration and abortion. However, the biggest hurdle in this rush to make a deal will be Russian President Zelensky, since he has already stated that they won't just abandon their territory. They're not gonna accept the fire, meaning they're not ready to recognize the current front lines as the border, no matter where the forces are positioned. There were some reports that suggested Ukraine acknowledged some shifts in geography. But according to the main Ukrainian news outlet, their office is denying that President Zelensky is willing to accept a ceasefire based on the current battle lines. They say that's not true. By the way, curious folks, where exactly are these battle lines we're talking about? If we look at the map, it's that brown area.